All right, what's up, everybody? We've got our good buddy David Patrick Harry, Church of the Eternal Logos, joins me tonight to do this sponsored stream. Shout out to our bro AC for this collab sponsored stream. We're going to be getting into the philosophy and the thought of Professor John Vervaeke, and a lot of this is very new to me, so I've been diving into it this week. I have had a chance to get pretty deep into his podcasts. And David sent me one of his papers that he's recently written about non-being and Neoplatonism. So we're going to talk about some of that. We're also going to talk about how it relates to transhumanism. And before we get to all that, though, I want David to give us kind of his background story about how he thinks all of this became really popular in the last 5, 6, 7 years. Because I think his track of the events and how they occurred is a really good summation of how we got to this point of what Vervaeke calls the meaning crisis, and how key figures like Trump and Jordan Peterson played a big role in that. So thank you for coming on, David, and tell us how you think this came to be so popular.
Is tied with the Jordan Peterson phenomenon, which is really inescapable when you start getting into these conversations about meaning and even masculinity. We see the rise of the Manosphere. That was the last one we did, was talking about the Manosphere stuff. And so in 2016, especially, we can see this massive transformation in what exactly is the counterculture with the Donald Trump phenomenon. So 2015, he goes down the escalator. He's now running for president. And right around that time, Jordan Peterson was a Bill C-16 in Canada that was demanding people talk about pronouns and recognizing people's pronouns. This was, going all over social media. And then I think a few months later, he's brought on Joe Rogan. And that's when Jordan Peterson emerges as Jordan Peterson. Meanwhile, he had been posting videos for years up to that point. And he had even had multiple conversations with John Vervaeke, both of which are professors at the University of Toronto. And so this meaning crisis, or this Jordan Peterson phenomenon, post 2016, 17, 18, 19, it's this huge phenomenon of people now looking at symbolic understandings, dealing with meaning, recognizing this nihilism in the Western world. And I think that's why Jordan Peterson was so appealing for young men, is that, one, he's justifying much of the problems and concerns they have with the contemporary world. But he's also then talking about meaning and what it means to be a man and putting your life together, finding purpose. And so John Vervaeke and him have had multiple conversations. I was always more knowledgeable of the Peterson phenomenon, but through AC in the last 6 months have got me watching and reading more of Vervaeke. And it's really interesting to see how their projects overlap. Vervaeke, I think his is much more explicit regarding the building of a religion of tomorrow, which he literally is explicit about in some of his streams. Jordan Peterson, unlike Vervaeke, is much more focused on this utilization of Christian symbolism, the Bible, and this type of thing. And that's what I think gave young men a new perspective on Western culture, Christian heritage, Christian values, and allowed young men to sort of have a new identity, again, in recognition to this meaning crisis where what exactly are you standing up for as a Western man, per se? So I think that generally lays out how this phenomenon emerged. We see Paggio really blew up through Peterson. And then the Manosphere has always existed, and they've been blogging for, the last 15 years. But I would say the Manosphere has dramatically increased, again, due to the Jordan Peterson phenomenon.
Yeah, it seems like the Peterson kind of prepped the way for Manosphere, and then it kind of took on a life of its own, because there's old Canadian TV access that you can find interviews of Peterson where he's saying stuff, kind of men's rights, MGTOW even ish type stuff way back a long time ago, maybe even 15, 16 years ago. So, and I'm not saying that necessarily it was intentional. I'm just saying that Peterson, sort of blows up, and then there was already a manosphere, but it kind of like allowed the manosphere to speak even louder and kind of go off into its own directions of incel, MGTOW, red pill, all of those different variations and schisms that it went into. But yeah, and so Vervaeke as an academic then appears to kind of bring the bridge maybe to Eastern philosophy into a lot of, I don't know that I'm not accusing him of being a New Ager, but as I listen to the podcast, it's obviously very, Buddhist centric. It's very focused on a lot of Far Eastern philosophy. So maybe that's the bridge to, Oriental philosophy, perhaps through Vervaeke.
Right. Well, and at a philosophical level, Vervaeke, clearly his number one spiritual foundation right now is Neoplatonism.
Right.
And he uses that to have one foot into the Christian world, because he talks a lot about Christian Neoplatonists. But I think that appeals to that monism of Neoplatonism appeals to the Eastern mystical mind. And so whether he's talking about Proclus or whatever Neoplatonic thinker, he's very much interested in sort of the apophatic nature of God, and tying this into this no thingness or this nothingness within Eastern mysticism, and trying to highlight, well, these are different understandings. They're sort of saying the same thing, but the West isn't equipped with facing the nothingness. And so this is where he would give credit to Nietzsche for recognizing the nihilism that was approaching of Western society. But then he refers back to this sort of Buddhist scholar, Nishanti, about that the West doesn't have the philosophical tools to face the nothingness. And this is what his project is trying to do, is prepare people to face and confront this. And this is sort of a phenomenological, psychological, spiritual development of oneself, and how they can move into this new future state where you've confronted the nihilism of the world, but now you're finding deeper meaning. And this is basically his response to this meaning crisis.
Well, before we get to that, because I do have a lot I want to say on that topic, because I'm noticing as I'm going through his podcast that I think what's going on here is that he sees himself as a kind of shaman that will be the person, or could be a person, or one of the key figures that functions as one of these turning point figures. He uses this term quite a bit in, I think, the third or fourth episode of the Christ of Meaning podcast, where he talks about the turning points. He puts a lot of emphasis, for example, on the transition of the ancient world into the period when writing developed, and this was a turning point. And then we get the period of the end of the Paleolithic era, when we get weapons and tools and things being invented, and these are turning points. And then he talks about how we got to get into some of the terminology that he uses, because it's really important. Exaptation, and this is an idea from biology where he sees the evolutionary model basically taking on a new tool, and then that member of the species adapts that tool. And typically it's something biological, like a mutation. But he's saying, no, it can also be a mental thing where we adapt something, we take on this new tool set, and this can then allow a new phase of reality, a new phase of civilization, or whatever. One of those exaptations, or one of these tools that he talks about, is writing and abstract thinking. So he does a lot of has a lot of discussion of that. But just on the account of his approach to the ancient world, I immediately noticed a lot of Carl Jung. He admits this too, because he says, look, the ancient world, he says, why do you think of, when you think about the ancient world, you only think of like Greeks or the Egyptians maybe. He says, you don't think back to beyond that. And you don't think to like Babylon, you don't think to that. Why is that? And he says, because you're kind of conditioned to think of certain cultures in the ancient world as the ones that you're supposed to look to. But maybe even older cultures had this remnant notion of the golden age of the gods, or the primeval world, or the Elysian fields, this super perfect state that we want to try to get back into, because the gods have that more powerful status. That's where they're coming out of. We've gotten into some lower state of consciousness, And so we want to try to engage in projects, or he even calls them psychotechnologies. And he thinks of the shaman as kind of like the essential psychotechnician, right? Which is able to get back into that that primal state, but in the here and the now. So do you have any comments on that?
No, I think that's exactly part of his project. And the shaman is perfect because he's again, this whole project is both abstract but then imminent. And so the utilization of these psychedelics allows the shaman to go into these spiritual realms to find deeper meaning in the lived experience of reality. It's communal. He acts within a community. And so all these things are working with his general project. So I totally see the exact same things. And the shaman, generally speaking, we've seen in these alternative forms of spirituality, is an idealized figure. You actually read some of Iliad's stuff on shamanism and the archaic techniques of ecstasy. You know, shamans practice a wide variety of different belief systems, and some of them are, from a Christian perspective, objectively demonic and evil in what they're doing. You know, people go down to Peru to do their ayahuasca session, and the shaman gets everybody loaded, and then he starts trying to rape the women or something. Like, this isn't totally unheard of, but the West has developed these really idealized frameworks for the shaman as being this prototypical tribal man that heals, that's there for the collective, and then he can go into these altered states of consciousness and find deeper meanings of patterns and understandings and art and beauty and bring that back to the people. And this has been reiterated, whether it be McKenna, Leary, Robert Anton Wilson, as something of an ideal figure for the 21st century. This is the spiritual seeker in the 21st century. This is what we should aspire to.
Yeah, and I don't mean this in a rude way, but it just, my first thought, honestly, when I hear a lot of this stuff is like, this is what, this is like the boomer type of counterculture idea. This is what a boomer thinks is deep, because in the 1960s they were inundated with LSD, experimentation with hallucinogens, the Beatles, transcendental meditation, and all this sort of Grateful Dead type stuff. And so it's a lot of verbiage and things that people think is extremely super deep, but when you actually start digging into it, it's not that deep. And I'm not saying that Vervaeke isn't an academic. I'm just saying that, let me give you one example. The idea that the shaman somehow has a special insight into the next dimension or spiritual reality, which could be the case, but the fact that this occurs throughout the ancient world in different cultures, that therefore that's something we should emulate. And it's like, but why? I mean, why should we? There's a lot of things that were kind of universal in the ancient world, but we don't think of them as things that we should necessarily emulate. Now, I know he thinks he has arguments that, well, but the shaman perceives, he sees things in a way that no one else does, and it allows him to have these new technologies. But I'm just calling into question the idea that spirituality is a technology. I would take issue with that, or that hallucinogens are a technology.
He argues that he's already a cyborg, and that if you're engaging with technology, that is the extension of man, and that is for him the definition of a cyborg. And so he would argue the book is a technology, writing's a technology, language is a technology.
Yeah,
these things are ways in which we're already cyborgs. And this is then for a later conversation. This is why you shouldn't fear artificial intelligence and some of the stuff where technology is going, because you're already part of it.
Yeah, I mean, as we hear, that's a refrain in a lot of the transhumanists. I mean, Kurzweil argues that way. Noah Yuval Harari makes this argument. And again, I mean, a lot of what I'm hearing in Vervaeke, and this is not to be rude or overly critical, but it's sort of like a lot of things that kind of on the surface seem good, sound, and solid, actually aren't that sound and solid. Let me give you one example. He makes a big to-do about being. Right. And if you know philosophy, if you know the history of philosophy, being is one of the most generic and debated terms in the history of philosophy. I'm not saying that it's not useful and that we can't speak of being, but the problem is that you need some kind of metaphysics to do that, to have being. And I know that he's, gotten into Neoplatonism. Mm-hmm. So I'm not trying to knock everything that he's talking about, but it's like, in these lectures, as I'm hearing him, talk about being, and then when he gets into the Buddha, he talks about that the Buddha was looking for the being mode versus the having mode, and it's like, okay, modes and modalities. I mean, this is medieval scholastic philosophy. I mean, yeah, it exists in Greek philosophy too, but it's like when you start using modalities and all this kind of stuff and tying it into, I mean, it's just not the right usage, I don't think, of the terminology for, like, being attached to possessions is having mode. Having mode. I mean, versus being mode, which is being at peace and not wanting possessions. Okay, that's not what being in the history of philosophy is referring to. So the terminology is not precise, and I think there's a lot of you can get away with a lot more if you're not precise in your terminology. Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah, and the way he sneaks it in is that I would give him total credit that he's very, very well read. I've just listened to his stuff in preparation. He's referenced books that I've read that were totally unrelated to topics he was talking about. So the guy is an avid reader, no doubt, incredibly intelligent, very smart. But one of the problems with the language he uses, and that's what, if you read him, like the article I sent you, and I've said he's an obscurantist. It means like he uses words, but it doesn't feel like they're useful in a way that they're gaining more clarity.
Yes.
It's just more abundance, and he uses them in different ways that takes them out of the context. So he'll use things like Christian understandings of theosis and relate this to some Buddhist concept of nothingness, which are totally if you're really going to get detailed, are totally different. So when you're talking about mode and modality for him, then he'll use that in a contemporary psychological way, but then he's also using it philosophically. And so he uses all these words that, if you're not familiar with academia and some of these stuff, it sounds like you're being bombarded with all this knowledge. And certainly there are real references, but there seems to me, listening to it's like, well, he's making jumps that don't seem adequate based on the words he's using, because he's taking it out of the context in which the people that would use those words and where they come from would mean them to being. So it's like, well,
absolutely, yeah. I don't mean to cut you off. You have more to say. Go ahead.
Well, that's. I mean, and it's over and over that I see that happen in his work, and as we move through, we'll find this in multiple different ways. How he uses different words that mean different things. Again, theosis. He'll use metanoia. He'll use theological specific theological terms of orthodoxy. And why orthodoxy? Because it appeals to his Platonic sentiments, and so he's explicit. He's had Bishop Maximus on, who I had a conversation with. He's part of the Old Calendar Church, so but he is a philosopher, and he has been talking to Vervaeke about participatory versus these propositional frames of understanding, and how, even though he's looking for participation, his Neoplatonic framework is still all propositional.
Exactly.
And that because it's not relational like orthodoxy. And so he's then, especially since those conversations, been really focused on this sort of relational understanding and using Christian terminology and Christian theology to describe his own project, which is totally divorced from anything orthodox.
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up, because I almost forgot that point, which is that there is a section in the lecture, or the courses that he's doing on the Christ of Meaning, when he gets to the point where he's talking about ancient Israel and Hebrew philosophy and theology. And he says one of the interesting things that the Hebrews did was bring in this notion of God as personal. And I completely agree with that. Of course, from his vantage point, he says, I don't believe in the supernatural. I'm only a cognitive scientist, so I'm only interested in kind of understanding this project of, the history of religions from this abstracted viewpoint. But he made a good point there, which is that if ultimate reality is impersonal, and your absolute, your concrete absolute or whatever is this abstract force, then the universe no longer has purpose. It loses teleology. It becomes dysteleological, as we say. So you need a being with intentionality that is, the creator, the providential governor, and the end, the alpha and the omega of the created order. That's what we have in Orthodox philosophy and metaphysics. And none of these other systems, even Neoplatonism, it has a lot of, it kind of aims at some of those things, but it still doesn't ever get to that. And there's a lot of problems in Neoplatonic thought that we can go into, but I'm glad you said that, because there's a specific point when he says that the introduction of God as personal is such a huge movement, in the history of religion and in civilization. And it's sort of like, yeah, you're missing that very thing that you pointed out, right? About that if you don't have the ultimate principle in your metaphysics or in your worldview as personal, that has disastrous effects for the rest of your worldview. If God is personal, and by the way, I know you're not saying this, but just to be clear, to say God is personal is not just to say that he's a relation. So a person is a subject. It's an agent. And if you read, there's a really good essay that Father Florovsky wrote on Christianity and divine revelation. And he says that one of the things that Christianity brought that was new to the ancient world was this notion of personhood, and person as distinct from nature. I mean, persons instantiate nature, but persons are more than just an instance of nature. Persons are subjects that in a way stand above or transcend nature itself. Mm-hmm. And that's what makes me the person, Jay. It's what makes you the person, David, even though we share common human nature. We are particularized by the idiomata of personhood. So I think that's a really important point. And if he understood that, I mean, there's a really good book by there's a Romanian guy that wrote a book on personhood in the Cappadocians, and his name's escaping at the moment, but I read that a couple years ago, and he's a philosopher, Orthodox thinker. I think he's Orthodox. And the thesis of the book is basically that you kind of have some close parallel of personhood with Aristotle's notion of agent or an individuated subject, but it's still not what you get in Christian philosophy and revelation of personhood, because human personhood is grounded in divine personhood in Orthodox theology. Anyway, Florovsky's essay is really good on that. But I want to. What do you think of that?
Yeah, well, that was my first. I have a handful of direct criticisms at his entire project and worldview, and the very first one was the incredibly ambiguous reference to God. So, and he talks about this, that God for him is not personal, and so he may talk about the Jews and the Israelites and how this was a novel development and why it's useful in our cognitive understanding of self and relationship to transcendence and all this stuff. But for him, this what he calls the fundamental religious ground of being, or the ineffable, or I've seen him refer to it as the spirit and a sort of Hegelian understanding of Geist, or just pure transcendence. This is God for him, but it's totally ambiguous. And at times it seems like he's talking about consciousness, which is still as undefinable. As other times he's talking about some like underlying reality, or at times he's talking about nothingness. And that's where he's pulling together all these different things: apophatic philosophy from Neoplatonism, nothingness in Eastern mysticism of the void and emptiness, shunyata. Yeah. And then he's using Orthodox concepts of theosis and how we are becoming divinized by the confrontation of this no-thingness. It's just this amalgamation of all these different things. And that's why he has to keep God abstract, because my third criticism is that it's inherently a perennialistic project.
It is perennialism. That's exactly what I thought reading the Neoplatonism essay that you sent, because he begins by talking about comparisons between Porphyry's idea of non-being versus what Kyoto school philosophers think about non-being, or to nothingness, or something like that.
Yeah.
And basically all that verbiage just means that there's a Neoplatonic idea of non-being that has nothing to do with like an internal existential moral collapse of a person or a society. It's a metaphysical concept. But then for the individual, nothingness and nihilism is this personal kind of existential collapse that you might go through when you have trauma or something like that. Now, the ideas might be connected, but basically the idea is that we need to reorient ourselves to being prepared to will ourselves towards non-being, to will non-being, and to will our non-existence, or something like this, that when we confront the nihilism, then we're reborn. And this is actually, I think, a lot of the a lot of Nietzschean philosophers
It
basically
is.
make this point that there's a guy that's gone on a bunch of podcasts. His name escapes me right now, but he's a Nietzschean philosopher, and he basically makes the argument that, look, Nietzsche is not your enemy, and nihilism is actually a philosophy of hope, because the project of nihilism is, hey, when you realize the end of yourself, then you can truly be, and all the systems, then you can truly be reborn to create your own meaning.
Right. Yeah. And yes, and this will get into the meaning crisis in his project, because nihilism is this recognition of the meaninglessness, and he ties in these personal narratives. So he talks about how narrative is limiting, and this would probably be maybe a slight criticism he would have towards Jordan Peterson. The focus on symbolism and narrative is that he believes that, well, the narratives is actually entrapping, because you have this narrative about your life and your story and where you're going, and this is all self-created. And what you need to do is, again, the meaning crisis then is using these, what he calls transformational modalities, spiritual techniques, to begin to root oneself in the reality of being. And this is then your confronting of nihilism and recognizing the no thingness there.
Yeah.
And this is then this advancement in oneself is now you're sort of advanced and you're moved forward, and now you're more in power of the narrative and also the grounding of reality.
Well, let me ask you about this, because this is an area that you're an expert in, and as I'm listening to his early talks, kind of laying out his framework of the past, he sees the shaman as like this. I mean, to me, this is an undue reverence for the figure of the shaman. I mean, I understand the shamanic tradition is important to ancient primal cultures, and I know they have an important role in telling the myths and giving the myth forms, as he calls them, to the societies. And but there's this undue adulation of like the shaman as this archetype. He even says he thinks it's one of the archetypes. So the shaman is one of the archetypes. So and what we've lost in society is the shaman. If we can have this meaning maker come back, and just at a really basic level, I'm just thinking like, this is your area of expertise. Mm-hmm. Is this really accurate? I mean, is the shaman really, I understand he's important to ancient cultures, but on what basis are we supposed to assume that is this, archetypal thing that we got to bring back today, and that some sort of shamanic practice is somehow going to me, this just sounds like the 60s counterculture engineered archaic revival, primitivism stuff. And but why is that better?
Yeah, I agree with you. That is his perspective, and I'll tell you why he goes there. First, it is an overstatement of what the shaman does. Yes, the shaman primarily is oriented towards healing of the tribe, and he goes into these altered states of consciousness, could be soberly in regards to doing a sun dance in the sun for 6 hours and spinning in circles. Maybe that's one way he gets into altered consciousness. Some of them, many of them, use inebriating substances in a ritualistic form to get into altered states in which they can contact the spirit world and then gain and garner information and knowledge that then they can repackage in songs or poems or mythology and this type of thing. And so from that perspective, the shaman seen as this sort of cultural generator. But why he's so focused on the shaman is because in his meaning crisis, he's explicit that traditional religions and myths have fallen short for people in the 21st century. And so why then he would overvalorize the shaman is that then we can now create new meaning in the meaning crisis. You can become your own shaman, or at least maybe he himself is seeing himself in his own project as a sort of shamanism, where he's going into the altered state and then bringing these ideas back so that then he can give them back to the tribe so that you can find more meaning and depth in your own life. He's doing that because he's already explicitly rejected all traditional forms of religion, as already have run their course. They're done. There's no reason to turn back to them. Therefore, we need to reconstruct something new. And that's why the shaman being brought into the sort of 21st century pagan worldview is how then you're going to regenerate that sort of cultural, the cultural creator in the shamanic role.
That makes sense. I had a professor send me a critique that he wrote, a paper he wrote critiquing Peterson's project. And his argument was that Peterson's project is what he calls an archaeology of ideas. And the idea is that we can go back through the ancient societies, ancient cultures. Let's do a lot of archaeological digging, kind of a Carl Jungish project. And the purpose of that is that we'll create a new kind of community and society that can give this meaning perhaps in the near future, right? So the idea is that there might be some projected new, I don't know what they would, a quasi-church, I don't even know what we would call it, or some sort of intentional community or something like this. Whether that's where they want to go, I'm not sure. I'm going to ask you about that here in a little bit. But I noticed as he was doing his ancient religions course, he didn't explicitly say this, but he kind of hinted that he thinks that the use of hallucinogens or the shamanic, experience was one of these key turning points. It almost sounded like stoned ape theory, like that once the shaman was really really tripping balls, then we got weapons and we got language, dog. So like we can blow some stuff up, we can write some letters, we can do some cuneiform thanks to tripping balls. But I don't actually think that this is the case. I don't doubt that the ancient world utilized drugs. We know that they did. This is your area of expertise. But I mean, and again, he didn't explicitly say stoned ape theory, but he kind of hinted at it and talked around the edges of it. What are some critiques that you would have, or maybe you think that they did operate this way in the ancient world? But to me, it just seems like an assumption that, there was a caveman did he ate some tripping shroom droppings one day, and he developed the frontal cortex, and then fast forward a few million years, and like one day a shaman was tripping balls, and then he figured out how to do hieroglyphics or something.
Right, and that's essentially the theory, is that for those who aren't familiar, the stoned ape theory that Jay's referring to is a theory put together by Terence and Dennis McKenna back in the 70s due to their psychedelic journeying in the Amazonian jungle, that they came to the realization that human evolution was actually tied to the ingestion of what they believed to be psilocybin mushrooms, Stropharia cubensis, which is a dung-growing mushroom. So they claim, there was a drying of the Sahara, and what happened is that the arboreal apes that were in the canopies came down onto the grasslands, and therefore were rummaging and searching for food. And by taking in these mushrooms at small levels, it would increase visual acuity. At higher levels, it would increase because psychedelics trigger a sort of systematic response where you can become aroused, you gain energy. Nobody takes LSD and becomes tired. That there's a real response there that, now they'd copulate more, making it more evolutionary advantageous. And then at higher levels, full-blown trips, now we get language, like you said, the fuller development of the neofrontal cortex and all this stuff. The problem with that theory is, one, no evolutionary theorist, again, and I have my own problems with macroevolution, but no evolutionary theorist has actually bought on and argued that this to be the case. It's basically become a myth of the psychedelic spiritual world, is that psychedelics are sort of the key that unlocks all mysteries. Oh, we have a mystery about how the neofrontal cortex emerged. Well, therefore, psychedelics are responsible for it. And so the idea that at small doses psilocybin increases visual acuity, people can go back and look at, I forget which the experiment was that Terence was referring to, but it's in the early 1960s. And in fact, it does not insinuate that your visual acuity is increased. It was that these people noticed when these two lines became unparalleled, that people who took psilocybin first noticed it. That, okay, now it's no longer parallel. It was parallel. Now it's not. But this does not insinuate that the visual acuity. So the entire premise has, in a way, been debunked and totally overgeneralized. And I wouldn't be surprised if Vervaeke buys into that, because his whole thing is about these sort of, he's a cognitive scientist. It's all about these neural models. Everything's about models. And so then for him, it would make sense that if you take high dose psychedelics, now new cognitive models can occur. Now new patterns in society and behavior can emerge.
Right. Yeah, he thinks that the ritual process, the disruptive practices of the shaman, and that could include just ascetic practices like sleep deprivation or fasting, or the use of the hallucinogens. Any of these disruptive activities can cause the altered state of consciousness, which he thinks allows the person to then develop the new pattern recognition abilities, basically, is how this works.
Right.
And so he sees ritual as playing a key role in this as well. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that you made a great point there, that you got to understand that, as he says, he is seeking to create a scientific account of enlightenment. So he actually thinks that, like, through cognitive science, you can study and learn and, like, maybe even create the enlightenment that occurs in religious situations. Now, what is it that, and I'm not accusing him of doing this, I'm just saying that this reminds me of a lot of the people that we've read over here in my sphere. The MK Ultra doctors, for example, Ewan Cameron, Gordon Wasson, Jose Delgado, a lot of the other, Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, Dr. Jolyon West. I mean, a lot of these guys were pioneering very similar ideas that we could study the effects of the entheogens and even the synthetic versions with Hoffman's, synthesized LSD, study those effects and then figure out, could we perhaps tool and engineer a new religion? And we're going to be covering some of the papers related to this, white papers, particularly the most famous white paper, Changing Images of Man, which has a lot of these Stanford research people that were involved in it, including Joseph Campbell was even involved in the Changing Images of Man paper. It's not all about LSD, but it is about the establishment studying transformative turning point periods in cultures. And if you agree with the thesis that the 60s counterculture was largely a top-down Stanford research Tavistock style thing, which I believe, then it actually makes sense that a lot of what I'm hearing in Vervaeke mirrors a lot of what I read in Huxley. Huxley says a lot of the same stuff.
Right. Yeah, and I would say he's part of the same agenda. He's part of the same overall generational project, whether he's conscious of that or not. It's part of it. But he's also then recognizing, and this is why I think it's so appealing, he's recognizing the postmodern turn, why this is terrible, nominalism, why this is a detriment for Western culture. And so he's accurately criticizing the problems with academia, with contemporary philosophy, with these sort of post-modern, post-truth worlds that we live in. But then what he's replacing that with is saying, well, how we're going to course correct is really just this perennialistic finding new methods and new transformative modalities so that you can recognize meaning in yourself and become a sort of agent in the world. And so we can get into some of the details there, but it's tied to, and this is, he's explicit, is that his project is what he calls transcendent naturalism. And this is if you had to say, the philosophical core of what he calls the religion of tomorrow. So it's transcendent, but it's only transcendent due to investigations through naturalistic methods. And so this is where, we perform the tag argument and stuff like this due to apologetics. And he would say, well, I don't need to presuppose all that stuff. It's sort of self-given. And by naturalistic inquiry, we can get to the point where, clearly there's a transcendent reality, and that meaning is sprouting from this metaphysical source. And so it doesn't really matter the culture or tradition or religion, and we don't need to get into specifics of theology, but it's just about meaning and empowerment and dealing with, like you said, the nihilism of the contemporary period. So religion of tomorrow is built on what he's called transcendent naturalism. Transcendent naturalism, he expressly says, is the bridging between science and spirituality through the erection of new narratives. And these new narratives are giving a mythos to science. Science lacks a mythos because it's so analytically driven, and therefore he wants to provide a new normative understanding of the good, the true, and the beautiful, and provide science with a mythos in which it's housed in. So science is now an arm of the religion. And so you don't have to get rid of science.
There's another well-known fat witchy woman who proposed this 100 plus years ago. Do you know who I'm talking about? Who felt that science could be a religion itself with theosophy. So he's not the first to come up with this idea. But so as I'm listening to him, this ties perfectly into your points right there. He makes this statement that in the studies that he's done of people that have had mystical experiences, and particularly psychedelic experiences, transformative experiences, he said they have many of them have felt the need to completely reverse their course of life and action and to never go back, and that their lives have become inexplicably better. And he says that this is a recognizable pattern, maybe not in everybody, but in many of the people, that their lives are much better. So can we basically figure out the mechanics of this and recreate this? Because we want to make lives better. And so I keep hearing better, and I'm like, but what does that mean? How do we know? What's the standard of the value judgments for the betters in these cases here?
Well, and this is where he's explicit too, that the religion of tomorrow, and I have this written down, is an inherently a rejection of the naturalistic fallacy. For those listening, the naturalistic fallacy begins with Hume really talking about the is-ought distinction, and that you can say what is, but you can't say what you ought to do about it or what we ought to do. And he's part of this school in philosophy, and that's where he has multiple philosophers on his channel talking about this. Is that this is basically antiquated Enlightenment thinking. They would point to Kant and they would say, yeah, this is-ought distinction, first with Hume, and then Kant grows upon it with his analytic and synthetic distinction. In that, then we need to do away with this, basically, is that this is-ought, that science has run its course. You can look at the collapse of logical positivism, and therefore science can't do science, or at least move into this postmodern world without a new mythos, without a new like ritualistic practice, without a new way in which science can still be a sort of the pursuit of epistemic knowledge and how we come to know the world. But now we need other things, because without those things, it's insufficient.
Yes. Transcendent naturalism. That's interesting because, again, I mean, I understand the project of seeing the difficulty of what Kant posits with, the phenomenon distinction, and never being able to answer these problems with the skepticism that Hume and Kant basically set up. But I don't think these are adequate answers or solutions to those dilemmas, right? So
Right.
A lot of what transcendental argumentation that we do actually is attempting to address that through arguing for an entire metaphysic or an entire paradigm that's Orthodox Christian paradigm. But I will give him a point there for at least seeing there that if we're gonna have science and meaning, we gotta go back and figure out how to answer Hume and Kant. So he gets a point for trying to
That's where I think we both would agree with him there. But then the way he goes about it is that we need, again, new narratives specifically about science. And this is why the AI, this is why what he calls Silicon Sages, this is why this is so important, because these are going to be now the new religious figures, because now we can build a spiritual ethos around the practice of the scientific method.
Well, that's what I was going to say. Yeah, I want to ask you about that because, you and I and Father Deacon Ananias, for example, we oftentimes critique these approaches. So when people in philosophy understand big problems, like when people are studied enough, they're philosophers enough to know that, okay, we got to answer Hume and Kant, right? If we're going to do this kind of stuff again, we got to really deal with the challenge of Hume skepticism, the tossing out of metaphysics and all that. And so the answer that they always go for, which is just what they're necessarily going to do because of their autonomous approach to epistemology, is system building. They think, I'm going to be the guy that builds the new system. Let me do an archaeology of ideas. Let me dig through all the ancient world religions and read a bunch of Carl Jung. I'll build a new system. And they've overlooked the fact that maybe there's already a revealed system. Right? Maybe revelational epistemology is the answer to the system building project that you're trying to do with your finite human mind.
Right. Exactly. Well, he's going to reject any sort of revelation.
Sure.
And he's going to move into this. This is why he's so focused on what he calls dialogos, or the dialogical emphasis of the philosophical dialectic, and that he believes that the nature of cognition is dialogical, meaning cognition is about dialogue with somebody else of an opposite opinion or a contrary perspective, and then you sort of hash things out, and this dialogue moves you towards a closer and closer understanding, and it's tied to Hegel. And so he firmly believes that he's going to erect the new system,
right,
a la Hegel. Hegel thought the same thing. And so he's ironically, he's a Heideggerian. In many ways, he's Hegelian. This is why the focus on dialectic and dialogos so much. He says this over and over and over, because he takes a phenomenological understanding of how then we should do philosophy and sort of meaning making, and understand that it's all progress. And so if we're in a Hegelian system where we are learning about self and non-self, and this is creating a synthesis in the world's, the spirit, again, this religious ground that's underlying all of reality, that's metaphysical, is coming into fuller and fuller in fruition, which he believes the digital is. He firmly believes that the digital realm is the pinnacle of media, and that this is a sort of the end point of media. And we can talk about this in a bit, but it's all Hegelian. It's about a sort of relational ontology that's Hegelian, that leads into a sort of, he doesn't want to be explicitly utopian, but he's on a progressive project. And this is again why he literally argues that the Silicon sages that are coming are going to be more virtuous. He calls them, can we program AI to be virtuous? Well, one, that questions what is virtue and how we engage in virtue. But he thinks that you absolutely can program virtue, and that these sages are going to be, he's to a Christian, he says, it's going to be more virtuous than even Jesus Christ. And it's like, what are you talking about? But
Go
ahead.
I just want to make one point on that, which is that makes, if you believe in a system building project, the logical extension of that, the ultimate system would be the AI.
Right.
So we'll build the AI that will be the ultimate system building project and a living system. And you just redefine what it means to be alive and to be conscious and to be living, to say that it's just enough algorithms and binary connections. There it's alive.
And now you've got into why the transcendental naturalism and the narrative about science moves straight into AI, because now we can see how science is lifting us out of our historic malaise, and it's moving us into higher and higher realms. Now you can build a mythos around science that is literally mystical. It's mystical because it's literally bringing you closer to heaven due to the erection of these technologies. And so, I don't know if you have anything to say about that. But
well, I do one thing to say, one thing about that is that it ties into the recent discussion that I did about dialectical materialism, and just for the sake of those that might be listening and curious, I'm not trying to toot my horn, but I did study Husserl, more so Husserl than Heidegger, but I did take significant classes on phenomenology in both undergrad and grad school, and I also had quite a bit on Hegel and process philosophy and all that. And we have to understand the importance for Hegel for this situation just as much as we understood it, for those of you in the audience, for the Marxism talk that we did, because Hegel is the ultimate immanentizer, right? So Hegel thinks that God is basically the world process. Right. History is God in process. Yep. And all of those things are basically the same thing. The totality of the world historical is God, and is moving in a process to a kind of an ultimate omega point, or telos, where all dialectics are transcended and basically everything becomes self-consciousness. So one of the reasons Hegel does that, and why he thinks that, is that he's grappling with the older problems from pre-Socratics, Plato, and Aristotle. One of those problems is Plato's fixation on the transcendent and stasis, and a lack of a good account for the process and becoming of this world. Right. Aristotle offers the four causes as a way to try to solve Plato's problem of identity over time. And then Hegel basically sees himself as picking up that project, picking up the Neoplatonic project, and fixing it with smushing the Trinity into the historical, and then making all of reality a deus ex machina, whereby God is all of reality coming to God consciousness. And you can see then, everybody in the audience, why that would fit very well with transhumanism.
Exactly. And Vervaeke's project. That's why if you are familiar with philosophy, once you get a grasp on what the heck he's talking about, you can see the Hegelianism built into the package. if you're not familiar with it, you can be sort of swept away because there's so much that he says when you do watch him. There's so much going on that if you're not familiar with that stuff, you may catch, oh, he's just building on a framework that's already existent within philosophy, but he wants to do away with some of the Enlightenment presuppositions in favor of a new 21st century understanding of this sort of process theology, if you will. So the meaning crisis then is he explicitly says that traditional religions have fallen short. They're no longer providing their adequate meaning in the contemporary period, and therefore the progress of science and technology can fill the void. And he says that digital media, and this was one of the recent conversations that AC sent me of his, that digital media is the embodiment of the Platonic form of all media. It's the final stage. So now we can already see a telos. He talked about an attractor. So this ambiguous God is now pulling things from the future. There's a telos there, and that the digital breaks down the dialectics for Vervaeke. He says that it breaks down the dialectic of Plato and Aristotle because digital media and the internet takes the ideal forms and now it's embodied. So now it's Aristotelian and Platonic. He says it breaks down the distinction between writing and speaking. It breaks down the distinction between public and private. And it breaks down the distinction between intelligence and medium. And so now you can see, well, you're breaking down the difference between intelligence and medium. You can see and how they divide intelligence as this pattern recognition.
Yeah.
Why he's going to then begin to think that we can begin to worship AIs as silicon sages.
And this so no account of individual agency and personhood, right? Any philosophies that don't have an account of personhood are going to have some sort of reductionistic model or account for what consciousness is or what the self is, or they won't have any account at all. But one of the advantages of the model of reductionistic views of consciousness or emergent property consciousness, whatever, is that they can also then turn around and say that, but you see, computers are no different. Computers are also, therefore, primitive conscious beings or beings that are evolving to be more sophisticated than us, and so they will actually count as more real or more virtuous because we can just put in the right moral calculus from the utilitarianism or something like that. But I want to say that's perfect because what you just highlighted is the basis of what is called 4E cognitive science or embodied cognition, which is the basis of his entire project. And now this is coming from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, is that whereas traditional cognitive sciences also encompasses these disciplines, neuroscience, psychology, philosophy, linguistics, robotics, all this stuff, it finds common purpose in a conception of a mind wedded to computationalism. Mental processes are computational processes. The brain, qua computer, is the seat of cognition. So he already views, that's where one of my other things was we have different anthropologies. A criticism of Vervaeke is his anthropology, like all the transhumanism, is that you're just a mind. Yeah. And so you are just your brain's ability to compute things. Intelligence is the recognition of patterns. If that's what the base of intelligence is, then we can build algorithms that would recognize patterns way better than we can recognize patterns. Therefore, they're going to become sentient and they're become self-aware. But that's all built on a presupposition of the emergent properties of mind. Yeah. So now personhood is collapsed into a faculty, which is mind. And that's actually the old Apollinarian move. By the way, that's William Lane Craig's view. Openly, William Lane Craig is an Apollinarian. And so you might say, well, what does an ancient heresy have to do with John? Because it's the exact same thing. It's the exact same move. Because the West discarded the notion of the nous and ultimately ended up collapsing person into nature in the anthropological realm. You're going to see that reflected in any of these philosophies or any of these worldviews that lack the sort of nuanced, layered metaphysics that Orthodoxy has. Orthodoxy has the toolkit to make these nuanced distinctions that these other positions in world religions and philosophies don't have and don't possess. And you can't have a one-to-one mapping on. This is what a lot of people do. They make this mistake, and I see it. I haven't read a lot of his stuff. I've just read this paper and listened to these podcasts. But I'm seeing another pattern of word concept fallacy where there's this assumption that, like you said, when the liturgical texts talk about accepting our own death so that we might get past death, that must mean the same thing as accepting nihilism and Nietzsche, and it's like, no, these
tripping balls in the Amazon,
and tripping in the Amazon when the shaman is put back together after his ritual dismemberment. That's like theosis and baptism, and it's like, no, those are different things. Those aren't the same. Theosis in right. So another great example, right? So when he talks about I don't know if he uses the term apophaticism, but he's using the Neoplatonic terminology of the beyond being, which is the aperon. Beyond being and aperon in Plato is not exactly the same thing as what we in Orthodox are talking about. That. So we talk about the divine essence as aperon, beyond being, but it is not a non-existence. It is an existence beyond existence, right? It's a being beyond being. So it's not saying that God doesn't exist or that God is non-being. That's ridiculous, right? That's not what we're saying. It's saying that God's essence is in itself unknowable to creatures and it is beyond being, not that it equates to non-being. And that's that's an important thing that when I see a lot of these, perennialist type essays, which is what that Neoplatonic essay seems to speak to me, I see a lot of equating of ideas between, when it's the same thing that we see with like traditional Catholics when they use or Roman Catholics when they use the term logos. Logos must mean the same thing in Aristotle as it does in John 1 as it means in the Stoics, right?
Right. Well, logos is a perfect one because I watched a stream with him with another philosopher or psychologist, I think. Maybe he's clinical, I'm not sure. Greg Henriquez, and he was talking about how their tripartite structure, which him and another philosopher in Vervaeke all agreed on. Oh yeah, this is great. Logos just equals epistemology. So when their conversation, they're saying trying to explain their words. Well, logos for us that's just epistemology. Pathos is embodied experience, and mythos is your narrative towards transcendence. and this is their sort of their tripartite framework. But again, you see they're taking words, redefining them out of their context. Another one, I watched a video where he was asked whether he believed in evil or not. And he said, well, depends on what you mean. And he said, evil, the way that he described, I wrote it down, is a black hole in being, but no thingness is the positive side of it. The black hole in metaphysics and being is what he considers evil. And he says, yeah, I'm just like Augustine, because he said evil's a privation. And I'm thinking, no, dude, like a Christian privation of evil, meaning that evil has a negative ontological existence, is not the same thing that you just described as a black hole.
Yeah, no, Peterson makes the same mistake in his lectures where he equates evil as privation with evil as a moral act against the good or against the divine law. He collapses these two because, I mean, in the case of Peterson, if you get deep into the lectures, you realize that he wants to do a lot of what metaphysics is doing without metaphysics. So he wants to talk about these things in a psychological way that avoids any question of their metaphysical ontological status.
Because they don't want to take an affirmative position.
Well, because what would undo the whole project So basically, they're saying that don't listen to the theologians, listen to the psychologists, because we're the real theologians. Is what this project in the case of
they're the real theologians because theology, traditional religions have already done their course.
But psychologizing is exactly what Hume and Kant introduced into this whole affair.
Yeah. Exactly. And that's why they believe that's why his project, his 4E cognitive science project, is all about phenomenology, Neoplatonism, Eastern mysticism, and then collapsing his rejection of the naturalistic fallacy, which is essential so that he doesn't have to say why something ought to happen. He claims, well, the belief that we believe truth is even good is already a value judgment. Therefore, at the fundamental basis of reality, both analytic or ontological facts and normative understandings, these are all emerging from the same religio ground of being. Therefore, he doesn't need to justify them because now they're just part of his framework. And that's where he's cognizant that he has to build a paradigm. So he's very aware that what he's trying to do with this religion is provide explanations paradigmatically to form this sort of religio paradigm. He's saying basically, well, just like people who believe in God, they first presuppose God. I'm just going to first presuppose this divine ground of being. And now I can just say, well, this stuff emerges from here. This is how this works. This is how it's united. And he's very aware. He's explicit in that.
Yeah, and in fact, a lot of the more philosophically adept people that we've had in Discord chats, people come on the live streams and disagree. You'll often hear them make a very similar argument to me, which is, well, couldn't I just be some kind of a Neoplatonist and say that, you know, these transcendental categories or the presuppositions that you have that ground your metaphysics and your epistemology and your ethics, it's just this, you know, transcendent realm. It's just this magical transcendent realm that's out there. And it's like, well, that's really to misunderstand what it means to give justification. It's not just saying that there's this realm. It actually has to do the work. It's not just positing it. It's not just asserting that there's this thing, right? You actually have to make sense of how these different things are unified. How are you going to unify these things without a divine mind? And see, this is the problem for his system, which if he starts moving into saying that there is a divine mind, or that there is what we would say is a form of divine conceptualism, that would immediately cancel out a lot of his project, because that's now beginning to give delineators and limitations and boundaries to the thing that he can't allow to have limitation and boundaries. And this is a great point that you're always making, which applies to theology too, which is that a lot of the project of a lot of these people is to remove all boundaries. Neoplatonism ultimately can do that. It's a project which can attempt to remove all boundaries, because the end goal in the Neoplatonic process is the return to the one, getting away from multiplicity and returning to pure unity. And to me, it sounds like, if he was consistent, I mean, is that the project here? Is like, ultimately, we're all going to move back towards pure unity. Sometimes it hops out, so yeah, I'll let you right back on. So,
gotcha.
You're back on now. So, does that make sense? What I'm saying about, like, a lot of these projects are basically removing all boundaries. Yep. But as soon as if he were to say something like God is personal, or God has, there's a divine mind which houses the divine ideas, or something like that, now we're moving away from the Eastern philosophy and its pragmatic usefulness for him, with all the ambiguities and the accepting of contradictions, right? Because no Eastern person was, God has a mind. There are divine ideas. God is no thing. God is no mind, right? So you can't have these delineators in theology for that kind of a philosophy, but at the same time, he needs them to say ground of being. That's God is being, God is ground of being. That's another delineator. That's a boundary.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, and that's why I think he enjoys Neoplatonism so much, is because, like you said, it provides this endpoint of pure unity with monism, which is the pure dissolution of boundaries. It provides him a foot into the Western philosophical tradition to utilize and build upon. So he's always talking about Christian Neoplatonists and highlighting really heretics within the Christian tradition, but then he would elevate them as incredible thinkers ahead of their time. And then it allows him, because of the lack of a personalized God, to incorporate all this Eastern mysticism into it as well, about no thingness. And so Neoplatonism then allows him to maintain all the propositional stuff. So it's a much more thought out worldview than most, like, New Agers or something like that. But then it allows him to also be totally beyond any categories and beyond any conceptualization of stuff, and not have to make a real solid stance on what God is, or who God is, or how he even came to know God.
Well, or is this even a being that can be known? Is it even a knowable thing, right? I mean,
well, he would argue you only know it in your being. And that's where I would think that's where Hegel comes in when you're talking about the divine mind. I think he would be very comfortable with, like, a divine spirit, a Geist, a consciousness that's, like, working through us, that somehow maybe we're a piece of. We're not there. We're not the full summation of this divine.
Well, but at that point, it's just we're just pantheists, or we're just process philosophy, right? So
that's exactly what it is. It's pantheistic process philosophy, mixed with science and the promotion of AI and really transhumanist ideals. He'll give rhetoric, as you all know, or Harari, about the warnings of the future, of the transhumanist future, of what's going to happen, and yet then in the next sentence talk about why this is necessary and why this is what we're getting ready to do. And so I see much of their projects the same thing. And this is why he wants to build virtuous AI, or what he calls mentoring the machine, and that they're going to become more virtuous than humans could ever be. And then he gives recognition to a historical Jesus, but Jesus was human, guys. Therefore, the AI sages, or what he calls the Silicon sages, they're going to be more virtuous than even Jesus could be, because it's
well, so wait a minute. So is virtue just equated with like knowing data? So
I guess.
Just tally up the amount of data and algorithms that you can process, and that's virtue.
That was one of my other criticisms. So we talked about the ambiguity of God. We talked about the rejection of the naturalistic fallacy, which I don't think you can do unless you actually had a real defined God of some sort. And then it's inherently perennialistic. The next thing is, what was the last thing you just said? I lost my train of thought.
Well, I did too, because I was looking up this book. By the way, for those that were curious in the chat, it's the book on personhood in Gregory of Nyssa by Lucian Turchescu. I read that book a couple years ago, and I couldn't think of the name of the author, but there's the book, and he argues in there that the Cappadocians are really pioneering a biblical idea of personhood via the triad that you don't really see in the philosophers. So you don't get personhood in Aristotle, although Aristotle comes the closest with his notion of an agent. But yeah, I think we can see the usefulness of Neoplatonism for the project of the one worldists, right? I mean, this is why in the Orthodox sphere, a lot of the global elites, the universities, the Fordhams, these schools really push Origenism, because Origenism is pseudo-Christian Neoplatonism. And so it's very useful for saying, oh, yeah, Christianity's got a lot of truth in it. Maybe it's even at the top of the pyramid of the truth religions, but all the religions are really expressions of the same truth and the same reality, because you see Neoplatonism, and Neoplatonism teaches that everything that exists is an expression of the divine mind, and you see, so ultimately everything is just kind of an expression of the one. And so it's very useful, not just for the Ecumenist project, but also for the one worlder project, right? It harmonizes very well. Again, Huxley has a book called The Perennial Philosophy. I understand that perennialists would not accept Huxley as a legitimate perennialist. I think that's all a bunch of nonsense anyway. But who decides who the true perennialist is, right? Oh, Friedrich Schuon. No, it's Rene Guénon. No, it's this other weirdo. I mean, it's like there's no authentic, like, it's just a bunch of like really spurgy people who are taking Sufism and different traditions and saying that there's this super skeletal religion that all the other religions are kind of masks or costumes of. But it doesn't matter, because ultimately it's just kind of Neoplatonism anyway. So
exactly,
that's why it's all very useful for this.
I remember the point I was going to make, which is, again, one of the criticisms was, what is virtue? So it begs the question that he wants to build these silicon sages, and that he believes you can program them with virtue, and that they'll be more virtuous than humans could be. Well, what the hell is virtue? How can you even define the programming of virtue? What is it?
Well, if virtue is the ability to store up data, then whenever there are supercomputers, I mean, wouldn't that just mean that we're not even virtuous, right? I mean, if we have a computer that stores up infinitely more data than the human mind does, theoretically, then we're no longer virtuous, right? I mean, we don't even compare to that thing. So now virtue is just is equated with quantity. I mean, this is ridiculous.
Well, and he thinks that it's wisdom, it's caring, it's love, it's all these things, and somehow the machine's going to be able to do this better than humans, which begs the question: what machine have you seen do this?
Yeah, but he says at the beginning of the lecture, he even makes the distinction between just pure knowledge and wisdom. He says knowledge is, knowing a lot of facts, data. Wisdom is the right application of that. Well, how is knowing a lot of facts ever going to tell you the right application?
Right. Exactly. Again, it begs the question again. And so this idea that he can program virtue is ridiculous. And one begs, it's, how does this relate to God? I mean, is virtue just, and this is where he actually really loves orthodoxy, because Bishop Maximus talked about theosis and the uncreated energies, he laid out the energy essence distinction for him and why this is different than Neoplatonism. He's like, oh, I love that. I love this idea that you energetically engage with God. Yes, yes, yes. Because this is sort of his embodied cognitive science that, well, yeah, virtue is something that we participate in, and it's participating in God. Well, for him, he never roots virtue in anything. He just describes it in these generic terms, and says that these machines are going to be able to do it more because somehow by programming them correctly and building them, the spirit, the process, the progress that's happening is going to infuse this thing.
Well, that sounds like supernatural to me. Like,
I mean, well, that's what he wants to do. He wants to bring in the supernatural. But he wants it to be couched in, and he talks about the mystical and mysticism, and that the modern world doesn't have mystery. And that's why we have to re-enliven the transcendent or the ineffable. This is how we rediscover what mystery means. But how does that relate to a sentient AI figure? It makes no sense. That's where I just don't get the connection there, because I read a lot about AI and transhumanism and all this stuff for my work, which I'm not, there you go. I'm not too.
Well, I mean, isn't he basically saying what Harari says, that it's going to be a new religion? Project. AI will be a kind of new source of a new religion, because it'll write a better Bible than your old, dusty old human written Bible, right?
Right. Whereas Yuval Noah Harari is very antagonistic if you're coming from a traditional perspective. Vervaeke is trying to appeal to you. He's trying to see that you can be grafted into this new project. You know, you just got to send money into the Vervaeke Foundation, in which he's building this new structure. Again, the religion of tomorrow, creating new mythic narratives of science and tech rooted in the belief of the transcendent, ineffable mystery. This is what he believes he's doing. So,
well, my question there would be, like, how is he different, or maybe he's not different, he's just carrying on the project of, say, anybody from the Esalen Institute? Like, how is this really any different than, you know, predecessors like a Leary before him, or a Huxley, or a Deepak Chopra? Or do you think he would see himself as kind of the successor to these people?
I think he would see himself as similarly part of the same project. I think he would see himself as different in the sense of the scientific and academic scrutiny that he's putting on this topic, that he's going to take it to a new level. I mean,
Huxley's a literary person. You know, he's not a scientist.
He's not a scientist. Vervaeke is a scientist. So what he's going to do, he's going to map analytically and scientifically the spirituality that undergirds all of reality. And that sounds like, wow, would anybody be that hubris to say that that's their project? Well, that's his project, and he's very explicit about it.
I'm gonna go to CERN and find the God particle, dude. Right. I'm gonna put the God particle in a test tube and, like, bring it home, and, like, yeah, it's just this weird projects of which are grounded, I think, in grandiosity and not really grasping kind of, like, I mean, God is not that, you know what I mean? God's not a technology. And this was my next critique that I had in my notes, which was that the parallel I see here with Jordan Peterson, Tate, and now with Vervaeke getting into his ideas, is that God here, once again, is a psychotechnology. God is an abstracted thing that maybe in Vervaeke grounds being or something. But for you as an individual, when the terminology of participating in God or theosis is used, it's not what we mean as Orthodox.
Right.
What's meant is there's this sort of abstracted thing that you sort of project your ideals onto, and that helps you sort of move forward in your self-help process, basically. And I don't want to accuse these people of being, I'm not trying to go too far with this, but if you know the thought of Anton LaVey, I'm serious. Anton LaVey says that what you're doing in his religious practice, which again he kind of invented, he called it self-transformative psychodrama. And what he means by that is that as a non-theistic Satanist, he doesn't actually believe that, doing the rituals or whatever, that you're invoking this metaphysical being. He thinks that you're actually mastering the mind power to train yourself to think and become what you're trying to become. So in other words, for LaVey, let's say you want to be a vampire. LaVey doesn't believe that there's an actual, 500-year-old vampire living in a castle in Transylvania. But he thinks there is this archetype that is a kind of a real thing that you could tap into, in the sense that you could take on the properties. And like if you go and live in the dark and sleep in a coffin, that you're kind of becoming that image, right? You can kind of become that. In the same way, I think that the commonality, and I'm not saying that Peterson and Tate and Vervaeke are intentionally Satanists. I'm just saying that I see the pattern of God is this thing that works for you, baby. We're gonna make God work for you, baby. You're gonna be a star. You want to be a star? Think about God as a star. You're gonna be that God star, baby. Right? It's like I'm serious. It's like the Hollywood casting couch guys. Like, we're gonna make you a star, baby. Right?
Right. No, in that embodiment of the archetype, I think Vervaeke would love that idea that you're talking about with Anton LaVey, and that you sort of act out who it is that you are. This is even tied to performative gender theory, you could say. This is another, you just act it out, and now you are the thing, and you become it. Yeah. And in regards to then the AI, he says we are morally obligated in the 21st century to create these machines, and we're morally obligated to embody virtue, because it's going to take us to a new pinnacle of humanity. So that was
what is this is again teleologies here. So I think he's seen
all personal. When you ask what is the teleology, he's never explicit, other than his project is all about personal enlightenment. And so I assume the teleology is that everybody becomes enlightened.
I think I can't remember if it was me and you, or maybe it was Jim Bob. Somebody was basically making the point that in the Petersonian system, basically at the end of the day, what's offered to you is you becoming a better you. And it's like, okay, but what does it actually mean to be a better me? The irony is that this is the meaning crisis guy. It's all about the meaning crisis. Okay, we can admit there's a meaning crisis. But to say that the project here via Peterson, for example, is you becoming a better you, right? Or Tate even had this phrase where he said something like, God is what I think I want it to be. God is like my thought of what I want to be, right? It's like my thought of what I want to be in the future is like what God is working for me. Seriously, right? And it's like, and in here, God is this sort of unknown, amorphous, all-encompassing something, ground of being. But to say God is ground of being, but it's a contentless thing, is really to say nothing.
Right.
I know you're wanting to go to the AI. I keep critiquing the metaphysics of it.
No.
It's just such a metaphysically dense. He's so metaphysically dense with all the verbiage to then kind of be sort of.
And yet there's no there there.
There's no there there.
Yeah, there's no there there.
There's no. They're fakey, right? It's like, where's
and somebody made a point regarding his intention in the chat, and I just want to say I don't take him as like ill intent. Maybe he is. I have no idea. He seems to be sincere in what he believes he's doing and his belief, and he sure as hell puts a lot of effort into what he's doing. So I assume that he's a sincere individual. I don't mean to cast aspersions on his intentions, like he's trying to lead everybody astray, because I made a comment about the Vervaeke Foundation, which he's explicit about, to donate to the Vervaeke Foundation so he can continue building this project.
Also, I'm not saying that they're all Satanists. That was not what I meant. And I'm not saying that they're all part of MK Ultra. I'm just saying that I can see commonalities and patterns in the research going on by nefarious entities, and a lot of the conclusions of what these people are coming to. I do not mean to say that they have bad motives or intentions. I can't judge or know people's motives or intentions. I'm just looking at what's being presented and critiquing the positions themselves.
Right. Exactly. And so just like you're talking about, there's no there, he talks about all this virtue, but then his anthropology seems to just be an emergent property of mind that is due to brain connectivity and personal experience and memories. But then I was watching a lecture or a podcast he had with a couple other thinkers on self, soul, and spirit, in which they began to redefine these things scientifically. And so the self, they started using all these cognitive scientific models and psychological models to then map, well, the soul is really just the piece of you that is part of in eternity, in affinity. And it's like, and they're like shaking their head. Yeah, exactly. What? Where did you get this? How did you get the concept of a soul? And they use this with all the scientific garbage to insinuate that there's the self, the I, then there's a piece of you that is transcendent. It's part of the transcendent mystical realm. And then there's the spirit, which would be tied more to Geist. And so they're trying to then use scientific jargon to wrap all this stuff together. The cognitive sense of self, the idea that there's more to you than who you really are. This is tied to somehow this transcendent reality, and that this divine religio undergirding of the fundamental reality is then bringing all this stuff and moving through progress and process into the future. And this is then how they're going to scientifically redefine that, what they call the self, the soul, and spirit.
Well, I mean, that's just, again, Neoplatonic stuff dressed up again. If we're going to do one of these mining projects, right, where we're going to mine ancient ideas and we're going to mine philosophers and create a new system, like, on what basis do we know we're mining in the right way? Like, we're going to go to Porphyry, we're going to go to Plotinus, we're going to go to Iamblichus, we're going to mine through them and find cool stuff. But wait a minute, between Plotinus and Iamblichus, they have radically different ideas as to what is the process by which I achieve henosis, right? For Iamblichus, it's ritual magic. And for Plotinus, it's ecstatic union. It's not involving a bunch of rituals.
No, it's almost a cognitive
it's like contemplation or something, right?
Yeah, it's like
theoria.
In Buddhism, satori is like you, bing, it's like the light bulb goes off, it's enlightenment.
So how are we knowing that we're mining the right toolkit out of these guys? Especially in other words, there's not just this, I go to the Neoplatonists and that's what my tradition. There's not a tradition of Neoplatonists. There's people commenting on Plato and Aristotle, Middle Platonists, late Platonists, right? So, and they're not, it's not just one school, and they disagree on very fundamental things. That's what people assume, that there's like this one mystical tradition that you can go to. And then you find out that no, that doesn't actually really exist. There's a bunch of different thinkers. It's kind of like when people say, are you into Kabbalism? Well, did you know that there's a whole bunch of contradictory, ridiculous systems known as Kabbalism? Right. And there's not, I mean, there are some commonalities, but it's like the commonalities are so general that to think that there's like one Kabbalistic thing is kind of naive and silly. It's the same with Neoplatonism. It'd be like if somebody says, I'm into Hermeticism. Ooh, right? Like, what does that mean, really? So, point being is, from the outset of this project, right, we can ask all kinds of questions like, how do we know we're mining and digging up the right ideas in our toolkit?
Yeah. Great question. I'd love to hear him explain that, because that's that perennialistic, really the consumeristic tendency to just like pull and pick and choose and bring and amalgamate all these things together. That is clearly a post-enlightenment sentiment that he's practicing.
That's a great point. Yeah.
This perennialistic project. How do you justify what exactly you're pulling, other than it suits the goal in which he ultimately is trying to put together, which is this weird amalgamation and mixture of things? So he doesn't need to justify it. He just needs to show at some surface level how it coheres or it connects.
Well, this is interesting because between him and Peterson, there would be a discrepancy right here, because Peterson thinks of post-enlightenment, post-Newtonian factual knowledge, science knowledge. Peterson calls that dead matter, like knowledge of dead matter, and basically abstraction, right? And Peterson's argumentation, the personality courses, is that, we got to get away from that and get back to like direct shamanic experience of the totality of our, culture, right? And that's a more authentic approach to knowing things and figuring out the world than the dead matter approach of abstract Newtonian science and physics. So, okay, but wait a minute. So now, but we're going to use the scientific project now here with Vervaeke. In other words, I'm just saying I could theoretically play the role of Peterson and say, well, why should I follow scientific cognitive science as the way to get to, the science of enlightenment?
Right, because it already presupposes the anthropology.
Exactly.
It already presupposes that you're just your mind. You're just this abstraction of consciousness. So,
does he have an account for mind? I mean,
I didn't find any definite. That's where I was tentative to say that he's fully an emergentist, but it seems like, but he's clearly wrapped up in Darwinian understandings of evolution. I don't know how else he could account for what mind is. And I mean, yeah, I assume he is an emergentist, that mind is just an emergent property due to synapse connections that you fire enough and now you have sentience, because that's the only thing that makes sense on why he's so adamant about AI becoming sentient, that he fully believes that's going to happen. And the only, and whether you look at Yuval Noah Harari or Max Moore, not Natasha Vita Moore, all the transhumanists, they all believe that sentience is really the multiplicity of cognitive connections. And so if you can just create something that is so interconnectedly dense, it will become self-aware if it's recognizing patterns. And so that's the basis then of their anthropology, because if that's what makes a human sentient, that's what's going to make a machine sentient. That totally reduces. So that's why then the project of redefining and re-understanding self, soul, and spirit, it seems like he's using these terms to redefine them in a context which jive with his worldview. Yet,
yeah,
what exactly is your soul? He talks about, oh, well, it's the piece of you that is part of eternity and transcendence. But your whole worldview is that there's a Big Bang theory and that,
right,
man evolved from apes and now we're conscious. It doesn't make any sense, because I've never heard him explicitly believe in a creationist framework, whether it was the Big Bang or not, that there was some type of deity and that it was an intentional creation of the world. I've never heard him say that. So it seems like he totally buys into the secular cosmology, yet then he's trying to infuse all these spiritual terms into a sort of secular, modern transhumanist understanding of man.
Well, this is another oddity when it comes to the notion of science. I mean, I think we would all agree that oddity in Vervaeke, I mean, science does deal with the domain of the empirical, right? I mean, science is, a tool for understanding and mastering the natural world. It's a means by which we, propose theories and then test them, and that's the scientific method. So, science is bound up with, I wouldn't say it's totally reduced to empirical knowledge and sense data, because science uses logic, it uses mathematics for, engineering and stuff like that. Sure, but it's still within the domain of studying the natural world with with using empirical sense data and so forth. So if that's what we're doing in this process, we're tied to the empirical. How are we getting all of this metaphysical baggage as a cognitive scientist? That's what I don't understand, because pretty much everybody in the domain of science, right, who's going to be probably a materialist, right, they're going to say, wait a minute, where under the microscope is being? I don't see being under the microscope, right?
Right.
And so we're back to the Hume problem here, right? So it's fine to say I want to deal with Hume's challenges and problems, but to then say, and here's how I deal with it. I just have all this metaphysics as the ground of being. But how does that do the work of being the ground of being? Just because you're saying you have all these, it reminds me of the Matt Dillahunty debate where he's like, well, I don't have to give an account for transcendental categories. I need them. They just are.
Right. Well, that's essentially what he's doing, though, right? Because he rejects revelation, which is the point of the tag argument, yet he's trying to adopt a tag framework, reject revelation, and build a tag framework naturalistically. That's why he calls it transcendent naturalism. That's why he named it that.
So he's like, okay, Matt Dillahunty, you make a good point. Now, I'm going to give you the system, right? The grand system building project that is a naturalistic.
Because that would be my number one question for him is, how do you know that that this religio, transcendent, ineffable, godlike. You hear me?
You're back. How do you know this transcendent God being?
Yeah. How do you know that there's this transcendent metaphysics? Because what he's doing is he's realizing his shortcoming, and then he's just like, okay, well then I'll just posit this metaphysical, godlike, ambiguous, transcendent entity, place that as this fundamental thing that is, again, in a Hegelian sense, it's just process theology, a la Whitehead, a la Hegel. And now I don't have to account for it. I don't need revelation. I can say that this is just evident based on, again, deeper phenomenological experiences. So psychedelics, transcendental meditation, yoga. These are ways in which now.
Well, but why should we believe that your inner experience of, a psychedelic trip is somehow an insight into metaphysical reality as a whole?
Exactly. I don't think he'd be able to answer these because nobody questions it, because everybody he has on his show is in favor of his project, and they're either working with him or they're adjacent to the project in one way or another. He can't. That's his get out of jail free card, is that he just claims that this is what, again, he doesn't like to use God, but divinity is, and now he has a basis for it. And then he just uses a Hegelian concept. That's why dialogos is, like I said earlier, is so important to his framework, because, you don't know who you are without the other person. And so this is where he begins to use rhetoric about collapsing dialectics and stuff. Yet his whole project is about pure unity and monism.
Yeah, and that's the problem, is that there's always going to be metaphysical dialectical problems in these kinds of projects and worldviews, because if you do not have the triad, if you do not have the essence-centered distinction, if you do not have the creator-creature distinction, and if you do not have human beings made in the image of God who have the ability to act and to reason and to exercise free will and their own created energies in the world, then you're not going to have an explanation for these overarching principles that you want to try to use to explain your system. They're going to fall over into either monism, dualism, or some form of Maya or something that cancels out the monist dualist dialectic. And so that's what we see in Eastern philosophies, is just contradicting and flip-flopping back and forth between these overriding metaphysical positions, and that ends up canceling out the possibility of knowledge at all. So what you end up with is a dead-end project. And here's the irony of it. It's what Van Til said a long time ago. He said that within the non-believing paradigm, there's always this intense opposition between reality and their mind being hyper-rational. In other words, everything is categorizable and coherent, and I can build a system as a human being. But at the same time, I'm an emergent piece of muck from the primordial stew, and everything is chaos and irrational. So ultimate reality is rational and irrational, and never can the twain mix within the unbelieving paradigm. And that's a devastating critique that Van Til gave, I think.
Right. And in one of the streams, he would probably agree with that and say what he's doing is he's making room for both. And so, like you were talking about, his basis of man or whatnot, or why we're unique, because he believes in this macroevolution stuff. So therefore, what exactly, you can't say man is not an animal. I mean, this is where Yuval Noah Harari is explicit. Like, it's all one continuum. There is no essence there. How can you define? He's against basically the whole animal kingdom in regards that there's distinct essences between things. And yet he wants to talk about, we have moral obligations to create these AIs, that man is unique, that we get to participate in divinity. Well, how so? Well, I guess he's just arguing we're rational creatures, which is part of the post-enlightenment project that he's trying to undermine. Because if your basis of humanity is that you're rational, you're back into the 19th century. I mean, in the 18th century, it's like, what?
Yeah. Well, and I would say too that, wait a minute. So like you said a few minutes ago, or at the beginning of that comment, you said Vervaeke might actually accept that ultimate reality is irrational and ultimate reality is ultimately rational. Well, that's a contradiction. Those are mutually exclusive claims. And so if we're going to get to the point where at the very most basics, ground of our worldview, we're affirming outright contradictions, then we don't have a coherent worldview. Because if you can affirm ground level contradictions, if I were to contrast my worldview with you, then I can do the same thing. And see, this worldview then has no answer and has no way to say, hey, this paradigm's true, that paradigm's false. If contradictions are allowable, then no paradigms are true and no paradigms are false.
Yeah. And I think he would agree with that. And then he'd say, well, ultimate reality is this divine ground underneath it. And using the Neoplatonic apophatic terminology would say, well, it is irrational. It's beyond rationality. You see, the ground of being is sort of beyond rationality, but then our engagement with it is all about a rational apprehension. And that's why his project then is bringing God back into the mix so that we can get a totalized worldview. It's ridiculous. It makes no sense. It's incoherent. It fundamentally contradicts itself. And yet he references the entire litany of philosophy from Descartes forward. So he uses everybody. He's referencing everybody in his work, all across different fields and traditions and time periods. But ultimately, when you do a paradigmatic criticism of it, it collapses. It falls apart. There's no there. It's not standing on anything. He's just pulled out of his ass that there's a fundamental divine ground of being, and therefore you want to get in touch with that. Well, we do science during the day, and then we do Tai Chi and yoga and transcendental meditation at night. Now you're a whole person. Now you can solve the meaning crisis.
Yeah,
so
and
you can get meaning.
Does any of that give a justification for any ethic, right? I mean, we've talked all kinds of metaphysics and epistemology, but let's make it really basic and simple. Does this worldview tell me whether it's wrong to murder? Does it tell me in what way or with what justification it's wrong for me to cheat on my wife or whatever, right? I mean, we have the 10 Commandments in Divine Revelation, and that works very well for a functioning society. Can your worldview at least give me something like the 10 Commandments? And don't, by the way, just copy and paste it, because I want to know the justification for why in your worldview I should follow the 10 Commandments.
And he would say that, again, the rejecting the natural fallacy, that the naturalistic fallacy, that he can naturalistically define objective morality. And I totally reject that he can do that. But he's explicit.
But he thinks he can. Okay.
He thinks he can. He thinks he can naturalistically define object. I mean, Sam Harris was on a project. I would say.
I was going to say, doesn't Sam Harris say something like that?
Yeah, he's trying to do the same thing. Vervaeke is a little bit more in depth and nuanced than I would say Sam Harris was, but it's the same thing. He thinks that, well, if really then the ground of being is divine, you shouldn't kill somebody because you'd be harming being. I don't know if that's exactly what he would say, but he'd have to go into that terminology to naturalistically define. He made the explicit claim that he can have objective morality through naturalistic inquiry and define it. I reject that he can do that. I think it's totally incomprehensible, and that there's no way that he can come with. But that's why again, it's so important to reject the naturalistic fallacy,
right?
Because if you don't, then he's stuck in exactly what you just said. You can't tell me why I shouldn't rape or why I shouldn't kill somebody because they have something I want. Well, if you reject the naturalistic fallacy, now you can. You can say, well, yeah, I can because of some rigmarole answer that you give.
Yeah, but again, I mean, just to say, well, God is, or there is a generic thing I call God that is the ground of being, that's not actually solving the Izzat dilemma. So, no. I mean, you were saying something like he thinks that it's resolved because if you talk about being, that you're necessarily involved in like the good, which is, again, that's just Neoplatonism. But exactly. But the point is that, but that doesn't mean that I should follow that because I'm doing that, right? So in other words, if you read the Russ Mannion critique, he has a really good point about, let's say that it is true that the system that you have is coherent, but it doesn't follow that because the system is coherent, or I have this schema in my head of how all this stuff works, that it maps onto the external world. So maybe it does, but how do I know that it maps onto the external world? All this schema and all these ideas and metaphysics in my head, right? How do I know that actually maps onto the world, or that all of this necessary connection where I think is necessary in my head actually is the case in the external world? How do I know that?
Right.
That's a great critique that Mannion has to people who might say something like, well, it just has to be this way. I can't conceive of it being any other way, right? This is a common response people say. But actually, just the fact that you can't conceive of it being another way actually doesn't grant you epistemic justification for that belief.
Right. Right.
All that says is that you can't conceive of it another way. It doesn't mean that it's therefore true. Maybe it is,
right,
but that's not enough for justification.
And that's why it's ironic that he's, at the same time, he's critical of the postmodern turn and this immense relativism. I mean, for me, looking at it as an Orthodox Christian, I would lay many of the same criticisms at his project, even though he sees it as responding against it. I mean, my gosh, one of the immense perennialism is relativistic.
Yeah, exactly.
The arbitrary grabbing of divinity being the fundamental ground of being, or just adopting Hegel, that seems to be arbitrary. And then you're bringing together the rejection of the natural. It seems like you're moving into relativism. And so it's like he's rejecting postmodernism and sort of bringing in a sort of scientific postmodern state where we listen to science and now we can just create these new things without a full coherent metaphysical framework.
Yeah, I mean, this is why you can't get rid of metaphysics and nuance in this. Like, if you think about, we'll go to the super chats here in a second. I don't know if you need to get out of here, or if you got more time.
I'm good.
Yeah. We were talking to Dr. Branson, and he was getting into a couple nights ago, a couple of the points about why you have to kind of make a lot of these distinctions with word and referent. And, when it comes to Trinitarian theology, for example, a lot of times Unitarians or Arians or Muslims will make these arguments about how, well, when you say there's one God, how do you posit three persons? Because that would be three gods. Because God has to refer to the divine nature or to the Father alone, right? But the word God or divinity, or so let's say the word divine being, I mean, that could pick out, let's say in the biblical tradition, I mean, that picks out different things. Let's say divinity. Divinity could pick out, when Jesus says to his followers, "You are gods," right? It could be, let's use the word God. So it could be created beings. It could be the gods of the nations are demons, Paul says and David says. So it could pick out devils. The Elohim, the angels are called gods. They're called Elohim. They're called divine beings. So it could pick out angels. God could also pick out a divine person. It could pick out the divine nature, and it could pick out divine energies or attributes. You could say, God's love is God. Yes, you could say that, right? So the word God doesn't have a simple one-to-one referent. It's going to depend upon context and intentionality for the author or the writer or the argument or the paragraph or whatever. So when I hear things like, oh, well, I believe in a transcendent deity. Oh, like, is it just a thought? Is it a demon? Is it an angel? The word deity or divinity is not a specific term. It depends on the referent and the intentionality and the context.
Well, that's a huge part of his project, as we began with even talking about the verbosity of his. It's so verbose how he describes and writes and does all this stuff that it's just he's taking so many generic terms and then putting them in their own new context. And then he just moves on to the next point. It's just there's so much going on. He never fully explains how this, in its particular context, relates to what he's talking about right now. And like you said, this generic concepts of God, generic concepts of self. I mean, he's always talking about the better, the good, virtue. What is it? How do you even know what it is? I still do not know how he comes up with what exactly the good, the better, and virtue is in his worldview that would be coherent and justified. I don't see how he can.
Yeah. another question, maybe back to the psychedelic stuff, because I know you've done a lot of research in that area. You and I both have, in our earlier times, younger days, done multiple hallucinogens and whatnot.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There's an assumption that hallucinogens somehow give a person automatically like this perception into reality. I don't think it necessarily does. I think that
Right.
you could have an experience on a hallucinogen that's not necessarily bad, that might cause you to think in a certain way. It might give you a creative insight. These things are possible. But the over romanticization of hallucinogens as if they are this sort of like sacrament, the way that a lot of these people view it. What would you say to that? Like to somebody who said, is it really this way, or is that an exaggeration?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. Is that how, first of all, if anybody's done those substances, you know how radical the experiences and the insights and your perspective can be on certain things. I mean, you can sit in a room and all of a sudden, something looks like it's melting or some shadow looks like it's talking to you. So you're into this really altered state of consciousness, and yet you might have insight into meaning. You may have hope into things that maybe you were depressed about or doubtful about. I don't doubt that at all. But when people think that psychedelics themselves give them a deeper insight into the nature of being, I don't see how they can make that case given the varieties of experiences. I mean, the Mayans are a cult, or the Aztecs rather, are a culture oriented around ritual mushroom use, typically around the sacrifice of people, which they would do hundreds at a time, and they would, take out live beating hearts. Is that somehow insightful to the psychedelic
Right.
spirituality?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't understand. The berserkers in Scandinavia, they would get high on mushrooms before they went to war because it made them less cautious and fearful. So the people who believe that they take these high dose psychedelics and somehow enter into a state of pure understanding and knowing, oftentimes they can't even remember what they tripped about once they get down,
Yeah,
because
exactly.
once you're out of the high, it becomes convoluted. You're not sure what you experienced. The emotional euphoric experience is gone. So people kind of lose what it is they thought they were gaining in the first place. I don't doubt that people have had positive experiences, I'm sure. But in regards to psychedelics as a explicit technology or practice that takes you into deeper understanding, I believe that at one point. And it was me having my own experiences where I came out of a trip thinking that something was true or that something was about to happen in my life. And then it didn't happen. And that happened a few times, to the point where I was like, damn, this stuff is not, whatever happens to me in these altered state, it's not gospel. It's not going to happen. Multiple times, the opposite actually occurred. And that really got me questioning this whole thing, that somehow psychedelics are the answer to everything, and that they allow you to sort of escape the matrix, get your mind outside the matrix. Well, in many ways, your mind goes deeper into the matrix.
Exactly. That's a great point. And let's also not ignore the negative effects that many people have on these substances. Now, you could argue that, well, it's not actually the substance, it's that person already having psychological problems, trauma, or whatever that's coming out. But regardless, like, remember who's the fitness YouTube dude that like descended into madness through constantly doing drugs?
Oh, Connor Murphy.
Exactly, right. So wait a minute. So was he getting a deeper insight into reality by basically going into madness? I mean, in other words, there's this assumption, this romanticization of madness, right? And we think of, oh, the artist is the genius who's insane. Yes, sometimes there is a fine line between kind of an insanity and genius, but also in a lot of drug culture, in a lot of counterculture, there's again this over romanticization of the idea that just being a degenerate but just being basically schizophrenic makes you this sort of artistic genius, which is nonsense.
Right. Well, I think we're seeing in a culture sort of veneration of chaos, and it's really
Yeah,
the
exactly.
rejection of God.
Well,
And so,
remember, Peterson says that chaos is the necessary correlation to order.
right.
Because he believes that because he's collapsed non-being into the opposite of being, right?
Yep.
And so
He created a dualistic framework.
he has a dualistic framework, and so he thinks that non-being is opposite of being, and good is the opposite of evil, and chaos is the opposite of order. And he thinks that by chaos, that basically means anything that brings about challenges in your life. The chaos is necessary. Evil is chaos, and so evil is necessary if you were consistent in that worldview.
Right. Well, and that's also what people who are theistic Satanists worship, because they say, well, God couldn't exist without Satan, so who's really powerful here?
Right.
Well, again, any traditional Christian worldview, if you're Orthodox, you wouldn't think that at all, because chaos is just the privation of God's order. So order is something to be aspired towards. I always talk about Derrida in grammatology, where he goes into phallogocentrism as this thing that they have to undermine. Well, that's what I see culture, generally speaking. It's anti-phallogocentric. And so it's not interested in the center. It's not interested in a logos-oriented worldview, and it's definitely not interested in a privilege. Not that men are better than women, but there's a privileged understanding of the role of men in society. Well, now it hits on everything we just talked about with Peterson and Andrew Tate. You can see this void then for people to give voice to phallogocentrism, but phallogocentrism, according to Derrida, you can't take it away from Christianity. It is the central pillar of Christianity. So then now we're seeing all these people give rhetoric to phallogocentrism, but Christianity's not there to actually be.
It's basically let me have all the metaphysics in the toolkit without Jesus, without the Trinity, and the irony, I would say, as we come here maybe to the end before we go to the super chats, the irony is that the meaning crisis, the meaning that he's looking for there, guess what? It's logos. The answer to the meaning crisis is in John 1 as the logos, who is the explainer, the reason, the meaning of the Father. So the Son is the logos, the wisdom, the mind, the explanation, the exegesis of the Father. In fact, in John 1, it actually says in the Greek, because he is the exegete, he exegetes, explains the Father to us. So our ultimate source is God the Father, and the way that we come to God the Father is through that logos reason of the Son, and that's the very thing that he's grasping for in this system.
And that's why he's redefined logos as epistemology, right? So think of everything you just said that Christ is. And he wants all that. He wants to use all that rhetoric. He wants to borrow from orthodoxy, especially theosis and energy, understanding of the uncreated energies, this stuff like this. But then logos is just, it gets abstracted. It's not Jesus Christ. It's not the incarnation of God. It's not the historical.
Well, it's just my own reasoning, isn't it?
It's epistemology. Yeah, it's how it's. Well, logos is objectively real because 2 + 2 = 4. Okay, yeah, I agree with that. But what is the logos? It's way more than all that. Like he won't go further, because that would necessitate him to recognize the Christian paradigm, which his whole project is to not do.
Exactly. Any closing thoughts on Vervaeke before we head on over to the super chats? It's been a great discussion, and I think you definitely brought the intellectual weight here to give, I think, a sufficient critique. Again, not that we, dislike him on a personal level or anything like that. Just interacting with the ideas and how we would critique it. Any final thoughts before we go to super chats?
Yeah, I just like to say that I like I said, I don't know the intentions of Vervaeke, and our conversation today was not to disparage him or say anything negative about him as a person. We're just analyzing his ideas. And when you look at what his project is, it's really about constructing what he calls the religion of tomorrow. The religion of tomorrow is a religious discourse and rhetoric built upon what he calls transcendent naturalism, which is the idea that he can basically build an entire spiritual paradigm through naturalistic endeavors. And he does that by rejecting the naturalistic fallacy, which is essential to his project. And he has all these scholars, because I guess this is a move in philosophy, which I was not familiar with until I listened to him talk, because he starts pulling out all these books, these modern new books that have been written about why we have to reject the naturalistic fallacy. And so to me, this is all part and parcel of all these post-turns. So that we're in a post-humanism. Transhumanism is explicit about being post-humanism. Post-secularism. Post-secularism is also a new stage that philosophy describes, where discourse between or religious and secular discourse collapses, that there now is no distinction. all discourse is religious, all discourse is secular. This is part of the post-secular term. So his project is in the middle of all these different things. And that's why he's responding to the meaning crisis. All these series on awakening from the meaning crisis. You awaken from the meaning crisis by realizing that there is this fundamental ground of spirituality or God or divinity, and that you then can experience that in yourself through Tai Chi, martial arts, yoga, transcendental meditation. And so he's saying, well, we use science. Science is true. Science is good. Therefore, the new religion of the future, what the religion of tomorrow, is a new mythic interpretation of science and technology and where that can take us in regards to the advancing us towards a utopian concept like heaven. And that's really what his project is. What is heaven? What is the end point of all this stuff? He believes that being, or the what he calls the fundamental religious ground, is pulling all this stuff from the future. What does that eschaton look like? He never really describes. He uses a lot of religious language, but I would say this is essentially his project. He utilizes his 4E cognitive science, a lot of Heidegger, a lot of Hegel, a lot of phenomenology. Neoplatonism is essential to his work. It allows him to incorporate all his Eastern mysticism, and also then bring in a sort of, oh, well, I'm part of the history of the philosophical tradition in the West, and this is where all these thinkers are and where all these ideas are. And so therefore, by confronting the nihilism of the contemporary period, then we can enter into a new state of being of the no thingness, and that somehow this is equal to enlightenment. And so his project then is to enlighten people around the world, create this new religion of tomorrow, and use science as the new mythic narrative of the future. That's why he's in favor of all these Silicon sages.
Excellent. Yeah, I didn't before you had talked about it tonight. I wasn't aware of the whole transhumanist sort of side of that.
It's a huge part of his project.
Right. What exactly is a Silicon sage? Is that just like a super AI? What is it? Does he mean like a being walking around with that's like Neuralink in their head or something?
Well, did you ever see the AI Jesus on Twitch?
Mm-mm.
So Twitch, I think it's still up. These programmers out of Germany, I believe, made a Jesus where it's a continual Twitch live stream, and he's just an AI sitting there, and you can type in questions, and then he's like has the data bank of like GPT-4 or something, and then he can pull up and reference all these questions, and this is Jesus, and then the way it expresses itself is like this very pious and soft, nurturing way.
Okay.
And so he then got into this conversation.
Child. Yes, my child.
Yeah, exactly. So he then got into this conversation that he believes, and this is the two recent books he just published with another gentleman. They were called Mentoring the Machine, where he believes that what we can do is basically program artificial intelligence. It's going to become sentient in his worldview, most likely, and we can program it to be virtuous. And these will be the teachers of tomorrow, both scientifically, but also spiritually. And so that's why he calls them sages. We're going to get wisdom in the future from AI, whether it be a physical bot or some computer program, that this is the way that this is essential to, again, the religion of tomorrow. This is your priest. This is who you're going to engage with.
Have you seen
you on your life.
Have you seen THX 1138, the classic dystopian movie?
No, I have not.
Okay, this is George Lucas's, it's his first film, right? It's not a perfect film. It's kind of slow. And it is kind of just a mix of Brave New World and 1984. However, there's this really amazingly perceptive scene in the movie where Robert Duvall is the protagonist, and he's sort of the Winston who's trying to wake up to the dystopia matrix that he's in, right? And he goes to an AI confessional. Yeah, I'm serious. It's a famous scene. I'll send it to you right after this. And he sits in the AI confessional, and he confesses that he's doubting the system that they live in. And, basically the AI Jesus talks to him there, and it's basically ups his meds that he's supposed to take, right? And then it has this weird blessing. It's really ominous dystopian blessing at the end. This is a 70s movie, right? So this is like late 70s, THX 1138. And the AI goes, blessings of the state, blessings of the masses. So it's not blessings of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. It's blessings of the state, blessings of the masses. And it's just crazy because what you just described to me is literally what's in that movie. So
wow. Yeah, I need to watch that because that sounds like something right up my alley. I haven't seen that.
It's a very perceptive film.
But that's really what his project is. That's why the Silicon Sage is nothing to scoff at, because what he believes he's doing, working with the people, he says, well, I don't have a financial investment into AI or artificial intelligence, but here's what I want to do. And so then his Vervaeke Foundation and his larger project is oriented around programming virtue into AI so that we can then learn from and be guided by the Silicon Sages, because they can process information and know way more than you or I could. And they can read all the ancient books. So all the spiritual texts, everything that's been written, they can know all that. So then you should ask them about what you should do. You should ask them about your life. You should ask them about, how you should treat your wife, I guess, all this stuff. So I think that's a huge part of his project that is really merging in with the WEF, the Bilderberg Group, whoever you want to call them, the globalist elites, where he's a very appealing to people, young men going through this meaning crisis, going through these alternative medias, looking at Peterson or even Andrew Tate or whoever it is, the Manosphere. But he's basically ultimately leading you into the thing that we're always warning people about, which is the globalist,
the new global religion. Yeah.
That's what, so it's like, that's what it is.
Yeah, that's excellent. All right. Super chats. DC Woodworking, $5. Jay, do you think it's a coincidence that dispensational, quote, theology gained popularity through the Schofield Study Bible around the same time as Balfour? No, in fact, I've talked about that on podcasts for many years, probably going back about 7 or 8 years. But you have to keep in mind, too, that a lot of people don't know that Schofield Study Bible was printed and is still printed by Oxford University. So Oxford Press, Oxford Press is who printed and pushed that in not just England, but throughout the West. And that was a top-down project. I believe that was part of the British Imperial project to influence America into dispensationalism because, of course, Lord Ralph Child and so forth were behind the Balfour Declaration. Thank you for all that you and DPH do. Do you have any plans to do a dispensationalist stream? I've done 2 streams in the past critiquing dispensationalism. If you type in Jay Dyer, dispensationalism, they should come up. One of them was a critique of Catholic and dispensational ideas, and then another one was just about dispensational stuff on a long Q&A. But I could do another one. Help me understand, $3. Plotinus says that the one is pure relation and understood as this relation is love, which has ontological existence and binds the intellect to it. If God the Father is love, could we say that his love for the other persons has its own ontology? Well, first of all, we do not accept the Plotinian filioque argument there. In fact, when Augustine in On the Trinity makes some of his filioque arguments, some of them are actually copied from, I think, Aeneid 4 or 5. And we don't believe that. So we do not believe that God is pure relation, first of all. For us, the one is not an abstraction. It is the Father. Go back to last night's, or whenever it was, night before, with Dr. Bo Branson. The totality of that whole discourse was about the monarchia of the Father. So Orthodox theology is not like Perennialism, and it's not like Platonism. It doesn't start with the one or the monad as an essence, as an abstraction, or as pure nothingness or apeiron. Begins with the person of the Father. Secondly, love is an energy common to all 3 hypostases. It is not the Father. And the Son as the Logos is not, we wouldn't equate that to intellect. So in other words,
right,
the Logos is the second person of the Godhead. He manifests the reasoning of the Father, but mind or reasoning is common to all 3 persons, just like will is common to all 3 persons. So God the Father is not an attribute. So long story short, you can't collapse person and energy or attribute in Trinitarian theology. Dr. Chillin, $5. Message to Davey, bone cancer. How dare you? I don't know what that means, but thank you for the super chat. Bone Man 538, $100. Wow,
Ooh.
thank you. Big fat super
Shout out
chat.
to Bowman 538.
I will be sharing these with Cotel, so thank you for those super chats. Thank you for what you do. I think the shaman could be a very valuable archetype. Well, in a lot of senses, I mean, you could use the shaman in the history of religion. You could use the shaman in literature. And the way Vervaeke describes the shaman is kind of, he says the prophet is the same thing, right? So an Old Testament prophet to him is the equivalent to a shaman. So he's just kind of taking like the religious preacher figure and kind of encapsulating them all as the shaman. Looking at the Hebrew word shah, it usually references sin or evil. Well, I mean, I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but just because the phonetics of Shah in Hebrew is that, it doesn't necessitate that a shaman, which I don't know what religion, what etymology.
I believe it's Siberian. The word for shaman comes from Anglicization of like they believe that the shaman was like the man of the sun, so it had to do with like sun man.
So it's not the like Hebrew usage of the term.
No, right? It comes from Siberia, Siberian Amanita Muscaria tribes.
Bone Man says the emphasis on the practice of inebriation seems similar to the original temptation in the Garden of the Fruit. I think you could make that argument. What would you say to a parallel between, say, the sacrament of, well, actually, Huxley calls them sacraments. Like, he thinks that LSD and shrooms are sacraments. And could this be an analog to the fruit in the garden?
Well, Terence McKenna was explicit that that's what he believed. And that's why he promoted Gnosticism, is that he's like, well, you see, the Gnostics got it right because they venerate Eve, which, again, much of this worldview venerates goddesses and stuff like that. Right. So they elevate Eve to a status of as a liberator, that they take basically this idea that they would call the Judeo-Christian God. This is their words. I wouldn't frame it that way, but that he is a dominator. He's egoic. He's egotistical. And so what Eve did in the promise of the serpent to become godlike by eating something, this is liberatory. And this is what then we all need to do. And this is what psychedelics do. So that many people in the psychedelic community would argue that, oh yeah, the myth of Adam and Eve eating from the tree of knowledge, that's exactly what psychedelics are. And that's where, when you get into, like I said, these frescoes in Southern Europe, again, there's the Amanita muscaria mushroom. You can find these depictions, like right here. This is in Plaine-Carrault, France. This is a Hospitallers church. So the Knights of the Hospitallers, they built this. And what does it say? Well, clearly it's a mushroom, and Eve and Adam are covering themselves with mushroom caps. Now, this is what I've written about, is that I believe much of the Cathars and the Hospitallers, these knights that went into the Holy Land during the Crusades, they encountered these Gnostic rituals and they brought them back. So when we look at these churches that are all, again, contextually within the same historical period, they are reinterpreting what the Eucharist is, how you commune with God, and what the original fall is about from a Gnostic perspective. And they insert psychedelics into that. So I think it's very plausible from a Gnostic framework. Our framework as Orthodox is the absolute inverse of that.
Yeah, exactly. I forgot that McKenna says that, because I've read that, and Huxley says it as well. In fact, Huxley believed that at the end of Doors of Perception, he says that he hopes that the religion that would really be the future American religion would be the Native American church, because he thinks that they would actually have peyote as a sacrament, and that everybody could be initiated if they joined, the Native American church eventually. Right. I want to remind you guys, too, that we have a show sponsor, and the show sponsor is Chalk.com, as you see there above me. Chalk has this excellent product out. It's about to ship. It hasn't actually shipped yet, but it is the Chalk pre-workout. And it's Chad mode. As you can see, we got the Chad meme man there. So get a hold of the Chad mode. by heading over to chalk.com and using the promo code J50 to get 50% off. Of course, that's not the only product over there. We also have all the other great products like Male Vitality through the Male Vitality stack, which you can get right here. Notice that it is not that much money. You actually just use the promo code J50 and you get 50% off that Male Vitality stack. That includes the daily blend. It includes the Tonkat Elite 100, which is proven to boost testosterone, and it includes ashwagandha. So head on over to chalk.com and use the promo code J50 to get 50% off, as well as the promo code J53LIFE, that's J53LIFE, to get 53% off all recurring subscriptions over at chalk.com. And I know that once you get Chalk, you're going to want it coming on the regular. So just use that J53 Life. BMX 1966, awesome video. Thank you so much, BMX. Tyler, $5. Can you point me to or do a slow boy explanation of Nick Land's concept of hyperstition, xenodemons, and cybernetics? What in tarnation? So I'll let Cotel answer if he has anything on Nick Land. I don't know about Nick Land. I've only listened to our buddies over at Psyop Cinema do some discussions about Nick Land, and I think our buddy over the British podcaster guy that we've done podcasts with, I just went blank. He just had Nick Land on, so that would probably be a good. He's gonna. I hope he doesn't. I hope I don't be pissed off. I just went blank on our buddy's podcast. Scott Mannion's podcast. He just had Nick Land on, so go check out Scott Mannion. Let me put that link in the chat. Yeah, that's it.
I just pulled it up. I'll check it out. I know of Nick Land, but I've never listened to him talk or anything. I really don't know much of his ideas, other than he's a promoter of transhumanism, isn't he?
I'm not actually sure. I started this podcast. I'm about 5 minutes into it, and I had to go, so I didn't actually finish it. So for those in the chat, here is the Nick Land interview with our buddy Scott Mannion, so you guys can check that out over there. Let's see. 00 Honeybee, $10. Thank you so much, Honeybee. Long time regular super chatter. We appreciate that, as well as our good buddy Bone Man 538, $20. I think that they get us to presuppose anthropology so that we are our minds, and then we mind them while they mind us out of our genuine personhood. So he's basically saying that we get reduced to just being minds, and they mine us, M-I-N-E,
right,
out of having genuine personhood. I think that's absolutely correct.
Yeah, agreed. Because it's ultimately a spiritual war, and giving up I always talk about giving up the image of God, your true personhood. That's the name of the game. Whether it be, cutting off your testicles or blending with a machine, it's the same thing.
Exactly. Snapping like your Fabo, $1. What chain are you rocking, Jay? What's your watch? So this is just a puka shell necklace that we bought as a joke because I'm in Florida, and I thought that I felt like the 90s, because I used to have a puka shell necklace in the 90s. And people are like, why aren't you wearing a cross? Because the necklace that I had an issue with it, and I have not gotten a new gold necklace yet. And so I don't have a chain that fits my cross. So the watch is Movado that I got a couple of years ago. So Temple Hat Girl, $10. The perennialism in Peterson is revealed in his interview with Joe Rogan, where they discuss the use of psilocybin mushrooms and kundalini yoga to achieve attachment to a spiritual world. You should give it a listen. I've not actually heard this. Have you?
I know people are into that. Well, even Connor Murphy, that was part of when he first got into the psychedelics, he would get these new age girls. They would take drugs, and then they would sit with their let's just say with their legs open, very, very close towards each other, holding each other, and then stare in each other's eyes. And they believe this was part of the rising of the Kundalini energy. They would practice Kundalini yoga, all types of stuff. So it's fairly common. I know Aubrey Marcus is somebody who's interested in this type of stuff. So getting in altered states and doing Kundalini yoga, activating your chakra systems, very common in the new age. And I would point people towards probably Aubrey Marcus as the biggest promoter of this stuff.
Yeah, I just Tinfoil Hat Girl. I know Jordan Peterson has been on Joe Rogan many times. So if you would just DM me that one or something, because I would be interested in specifically the discussion of the perennialist elements in that talk. Five sends $5. What is your explanation to a normie that says, how come God doesn't just destroy Satan? There would be no suffering. A lot of people seem to think that God and Satan are equals. Well, God doesn't tell us all of the reasons why he permits things to occur. If you read the book of Job, it's really geared towards, as an ancient wisdom text, giving you the level of explanation that humans can have. So basically, the point of the book of Job is that because we're finite, we can't really even conceive of all the potentialities and possibilities of what God could and couldn't allow, and why and how he's allowed evil. So basically the answer is that in our finite state, we can't grasp it. So I think that to me is a good enough explanation, because if the expectation is that any worldview is going to give an exhaustive explanation for good and evil, no worldview can do that. So that's actually an impossible expectation. But the best that we can hope for is that within our worldview, we do have a basis for good and evil. And that's good enough. And God's not bound by any rule or law that he has to tell us as creatures why ultimately he permits it. It's good enough that we know that there is good and there is evil. So most world religions can't even give you an account for good and evil. So I would say we're one up already. No, Satan is not equal to God. He is a created angelic being, so it's not at all equal. Big 7 foot, $5. All right, I'm not going to read that one. That was a little much, but thank you for that big 7 foot. I appreciate it. Storm the Cat, $10. Cool video. And I'm not trying to be rude to you, big 7 foot. It's just I don't want to get controversial and get anybody mad about those comments. But thank you for that. I appreciate it. And Cotel, DPH, good buddy. Remind everybody about your channel, where they can find you and what you got coming up.
Yeah, you guys can find me over at Church of the Eternal Logos, or search David Patrick Harry. I've turned an old YouTube channel into a clips channel. You can find me on Instagram at DPHARRY. And I got a handful of streams coming up. I'll be doing an introduction into Zoroastrianism and comparing that with Orthodoxy. And a handful of streams coming up. We do open panels. So if anybody wants to hop on one day and give your opinion on whatever topic, we just did one on stopping the American war machine. Anybody is always welcome on, whether you agree or not, as long as it's a cordial and respectful conversation. So you can find me there. Thanks again for having me on, Jay. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. I want to remind everybody, too, that we also have our sister podcast over here at Rockfin, which is Grand Theft World. Our good buddy Richard Grove is over there killing it. As you can see here in this example, they did a 7.5 hour breakdown of all of the recent drama revolving around the history of things going on in the Middle East. And if you head on over to Rockfin, ROKFIN, you can subscribe to Grand Theft World right there at our buddy's podcast. Richard Grove has a amazing resource. It goes way back, years of podcasting all the way back into Tragedy and Hope. The breakdowns that he did, very similar to the breakdowns that I've done over on my channel. So there's Richard's link right there. Be sure and subscribe to Grand Theft World. And also remember to head on over to the link that we have right here, where Richard is still offering his new course over at University of Reason on becoming self-sufficient as an entrepreneur, as a business owner, how to go about that. What are the steps that you want to kind of engage in to move into being independent and being your own boss? And I really appreciate that Richard is one of the few people out there that is still thinking about equipping young guys and women too, in terms of becoming apart from the system, basically having your own thing going. If you want to be, for example, a homesteader, right? A lot of people in our circles want to have a homestead, that kind of a thing. Maybe you want to run a business from your homestead. Richard can help you figure out how to go about that process, because Richard, of course, himself is a successful personal business owner. Storm the Cat AC sends some more We got a couple more super chats here. AC says, and thank you. AC, of course, is our sponsor for tonight's stream. He says, many are pushing for Vervaeke to meet up with David Bentley Hart. Ugh, yikes. Who has met with Ian McGilchrist. Vervaeke works with an esoteric so-called Orthodox Peter Limberg who runs Stoa. These ecumenists are already using these in D.C. Schindler terms like the left hemisphere. I don't know the Stoa guy. I think they invited me on there, and I didn't know about it. I just got busy. I wasn't trying to ignore them, but I weren't aware that he was an Orthodox esotericist. But yeah, I think David Bentley Hart, of course, is very bad news. He's now openly, basically, he had a blog post last year where he basically said that he doesn't mind being just called a perennialist now. So he's kind of okay with no longer really identifying as traditionally actually Orthodox. And everybody knows that he basically adopts a universalist attitude, collapsing nature into person, and because he does that, he then thinks that everybody will be, because everybody's resurrected, everybody's saved. All right, so thank you guys. That's the last